For joining us for today's webinar, CTI Overload, Making Threat Intel Work for CTEM. Just so everybody knows, we are recording this session and we will be sharing it out later. And if you have any questions, we will have time to answer them at the end. So feel free to add those in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to be in the chat answering questions, but I will hand it over to Pete now to get started.
Cool. Well, uh, as always, thanks for taking time out of your busy day to come hang out with us for a little while. Um, we've got a ton of content to get through. Pardon. I hope we can breeze through this and really get to the nitty-gritty of it because there's a lot of interesting things to discuss here. I am joined today by two industry giants. Paul Reed, who you might remember from other webinars that we've done. Heads up our adversarial research team. Can't talk about it. And we're joined today by Joe Mastromarino. I know I'm not the first one to butcher your last name. I've heard other people try.
Not the first,
Um,
won't be the last.
yeah. Joe is director of sales engineering for us, and has been around the block quite a bit. So we got stuff to talk about. We want to talk about yet another acronym, CTI, Cyber Threat Intelligence, otherwise known as Threat Intelligence or Intel or whatever you want to call it in your program. And we also want to talk a little bit about CTEM and not necessarily go through the framework of CTEM, but really talk a little bit about how CTI works as a component of continuous exposure management. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But we want to really put some of the focus on CTI because I feel like CTI, threat intelligence, is one of those things that is never done, right? You're never done with threat intelligence. It's incredibly difficult to source. It's incredibly difficult to implement and make operational for a number of reasons that we'll get into as the conversation goes on. And it's cool that I have both Paul and Joe here because these fellows represent sort of both sides of Intel. And what I mean is, Paul is very much on the research side of things and very much in tune with what's going on in the terrible dark corners of the world. And Joe's a practitioner, and it was more focused on the implementation of how we do what we do and how we do it as practitioners. And so we'll bounce back and forth, and we'll talk a bunch about this stuff. So let's just get into it because there's a ton here. So, Paul, I want to start with you. And this, it may seem like a silly question, but I don't think it is. When in your mind does an organization realize that they have a need for threat intelligence? And is it bound by some maturity journey? Is it bound by some event that occurs, etc.? What are your thoughts?
I think a lot of organizations start out their cyber threat intelligence journey, understanding that they need to know the threat landscape. And a lot of times that's simply by reading reports produced by all the leading research firms and trying to digest and understand what's happening there. I think over time they come to realize that that's just not sufficient, right? That's kind of very passive. They need to become a little bit more active and an active participant in protecting their company from a cyber standpoint. To do that, you've got to know your adversary. To able to know your adversary, you need to know what adversaries are doing. And so that's really where cyber threat intelligence comes in. So being able, whether that's through some open source feeds, where there's literally hundreds of them out there now, through different open source tip platforms to bring that information together to give you that visibility to start with. A lot of times people get their initial CTI through the vendors that they use for their mitigating compensating controls. For example, CrowdStrike, Palo Alto, others, Microsoft. And that's where they'll get their initial CTI feeds from. And that kind of gives them the flavor of what the art of the possible is. What you'll find over time too, as you go down this maturity journey, is that different CTI providers focus in different areas and have strengths in different areas. That's why you'll find a lot of the large companies have several CTI feeds that they leverage to get a better overall comprehensive picture of what's taking place. On the road in this journey, you start to get to a point where you realize that some of the information you're getting is kind of rear window facing, meaning that it's already taken place or it's happened to someone else, but yet you're still being attacked by things that's not covered in your CTI or, you never thought you'd be exposed to. And that's a real place of maturity. That's a real inflection point when you make that realization that you need to know what your local threats are, right? Who's truly targeting me? Where are those threats coming from? What type of attacks they're using against me? And that's really part of what we're trying to do in the adversary research team and AttackIQ as a company is to help on that maturity journey and really get them to that last step along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And Liz, I think we have a poll question that kind of fits real nicely in here. It'd be interesting to sort of get a chance to see what the audience is looking like anonymously, of course, from a maturity standpoint when it comes to operationalizing threat intelligence in the environment. So cool. Like that all makes a ton of sense. Um, on this journey, whenever it is that you decide you need to get started on that journey, by the time you get to some point where you realize that this is a thing you need in your program, are you already behind the eight ball? Is it too late? Have you should you have done something already up to this point that you've sort of been putting aside because it didn't present itself as a need, or it was too expensive or too complicated, or whatever? And a question for both of you guys, because this is both theoretical and practical. So what do you think?
So it's never too late. There may have been missed opportunities in the past where you may have seen something that could have protected you at the time, but it's never too late, right? It's like, when's the best time to start losing weight, right? Or exercise? It's now, right? Same thing with CTI. The best time to get started on it is now. So, it's never too late. And it's not going to get any better until you do something about it. Until you get that visibility and you get that knowledge that you need to protect yourself, you're not going to move forward. So to me, there's no time like the present. Joe, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and you start building that. You can start building that from within too. You can start to get some ideas from OSINT, your open source intelligence feeds, figure out what you need to collect. And if you want to figure out where you need to start collecting it from, I mean, think about incidents that you've had before. I tell customers all the time, as I've been telling for many, many years, a lot of times your best intelligence is going to come from internally. So you figure out what's happened to you before because these things are probably going to happen again. So start there because just like you said, the best time to start is right now is today. Start there. Start with the data that you already have. And you can work from there. You can work in some other feeds as you get them in as well, but they may give you the foundation of these are the kinds of things that we need to collect. You don't necessarily need to collect all the, all the things that are lower on the pyramid of pain, although you can start there and then begin to summit higher and higher as you go. But start somewhere is really the idea of what I'm trying to get across.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And the poll results are super interesting. They're kind of spread almost evenly across intermediate and advanced, and then broken up the last 33% between beginning and developing, which this totally makes sense to me. I would argue that the people who are intermediate and advanced probably have budgets and resources and are larger companies, and either that or have been around forever and started out through the lens of incident management and maybe not risk management so much, and or any other number of reasons, but still very interesting data. Um, okay, cool. So the next thing I want to ask, I have an answer for, but obviously I want to get y'all's perspectives as well. Um, so both theoretically and practically, the implementation of threat intelligence is hard. CTI feeds are difficult to acquire, at least in a sort of bespoke or targeted way, and insanely difficult to operationalize, especially if you're just getting started. And in my opinion, a lot of the difficulties in the operationalization of CTI is the resource commitment. You need money to buy feeds, and they're crazy expensive. You need people to implement those things who are deep subject matter experts, and you need programs and processes to get that stuff implemented in such a way where it's usable, i.e., operational. Um, And Liz, I think we have a question, a poll question here about resourcing as well. But so the question is, why is it so hard? Um, and you know, practically, Joe, I'd love to hear your perspective on why it's so difficult, and then maybe bounce, over to you, Paul, about, generally why it's so difficult.
Well, you hit on two of the things there already. The resourcing, I look at the people resourcing specifically because, and I think it's part of the poll question that we have here as well, is that everybody's strapped for resources and time. A big part of the time sink is going to be something that I experienced a whole lot even before my time here, because I was an old sim guy before I got here, is the data. The data normalization. The data feed that you get, you may be getting from the CTI perspective, but you're also dealing with the blue teamers data and you have to deal with the red teamers data. And not everybody may be looking at the data the same way. So to get everybody singing the same song out of the same book on the same page on the same staff, that's really, really difficult stuff to do. So normalizing all of this data in such a way that it would be useful to everyone is a major challenge. And that's all across the board. And I see that in every single organization that I go to, even people that have yeah, they feel like they have a really good sim and they have the stuff really well in place. There's still going to be a data normalization problem somewhere. And that to me is always at the forefront of my mind when we're integrating any kind of technology, especially CTI, because we need to say an IP address looks like this or a hash looks like this.
Right. Yeah, 100%. Paul, what do you think?
So I think Joe's analogy of trying to sing from the same songbook in the same time is kind of apropos. When you bring in multiple CTI feeds, right? The vendors all have their own nomenclature, their own way of talking, their own intonation, how they describe things. And I know from my own past experiences having to do that constant context switching between what I get from a Unit 42 or CrowdStrike and Alien Vault, any of the other providers out there can be very time consuming. And if you don't have a lot of experience and knowledge to understand what's implied by each of those, it can be very confusing. I
Yeah.
think trying to find something that you can operationalize on and start there, right? Get some quick wins, get some easy wins, show some value. Start delivering, context instead of content, right? A lot of CTI teams are like, here's a 7-page report about this threat actor. Great. What does it mean for us? Have we seen it in the past? Should we see it again? What happens if we change our mitigating compensating controls? How could we better protect ourselves by making changes to mitigating compensating controls, right? So, if you're part of CTI and you're producing those reports, it's great to say, here's the threat actor, here's who they are, here's how they target. But, what does that mean to me, right? What's the value to me in knowing this information and how can I operationalize it, right? If we are being targeted by a threat actor who starts off with a phishing attack, right? I should probably let my support team know, hey, be on the lookout for these type of things, right? If it's a financial based attack where they're going to try to convince someone using social engineering and pressure to transfer large sums of money, right? I need to talk to my financial team and say, hey, you should probably add some additional checks along the way when you get these type of requests. Or if it's, phishing emails, right? It's about, are my employees trained up? Are they trained to look for and be aware of phishing attacks? And then lastly, if it's going to be an edge attack or something like that, right? Let the infrastructure team know what to look for, right? Expect these type of attacks, look for these patterns, right? So the more information you can distill from the CTI feeds you get, one, you get a greater return on your investment, and two, you end up in a better cyber posture than you would have otherwise.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's not just about us. It's about and us being the practitioners, the people that are living in this stuff every day. It's how do we articulate the value of the data that we're getting from it in order to bring that back to the business, to show them that this stuff actually matters to them and that we're giving them a net positive value rather than just bothering them with this stuff.
yeah,
Yeah, there's a question in here about, how do we present this back to our senior leadership, right? How do we let them know our CTI is valuable? Well, you're not going to do that by telling them about the new ways that someone's going to use, an attack tool against you, right? That's not going to help them. What they want to hear is, am I more secure than I was yesterday, right?
right.
Have I improved my security? What have you done for me today? And Pete, I think you can really talk to this as a CISO, right? What have you done for me today? And what are you going to do for me tomorrow? but more importantly, are we shifting left, right? Are we getting ahead of that boom moment? So I know that you've shared with me, Pete, some of the things you did in your past about, now versus next. You want to maybe share with everyone else a little bit of that?
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to start to get into. I've been heard saying, a tagline about threat intelligence and some of the difficulties in practically implementing and making operational CTI as a practice is how it equates to threat and threat hunting, the activity, the process, and the program. You often don't know where to start. And if you get lucky enough to burn the hay piles down and find the bone needle in the haystack that tells you where to start, where do you go next? CTI feeds don't tell you, right? Like we talked about, a fair amount of that data is backwards looking. A fair amount of that data might not be relevant to you in your geolocation, in your industry, in your whatever it is, right? So you got to sift through all that stuff. You have to figure that out. That's part of the art and that's part of the science of security operations, but there are better ways, and we'll talk more about the better ways in a little bit. Um, and so piggybacking off of that, right, as we start to get into, let's start talking about the better ways. Um, there's two heavy duty questions that I want to discuss here. The first is um, piggybacking on what I just said about where do I start and where do I go. Um, a well-oiled CTI capability and the associated operational capabilities that go along with it to make it, good, require some things. It requires that you know certain things about your organization to get it right. So, what are those things? And Joe, we'll start with you. Like, what do I need to know about my organization to get my threat program right?
Well, something that I've come across many, many times is, well, where do I start? Well, what does your environment look like? Well,
Yep.
the attack surface many times is unknown. The assets that a customer has many times is unknown. Um, we talk about shadow IT and we kind of laugh about it, but at the same time, it's a real thing. And the attack surface is not getting any smaller. In fact, it's getting bigger and it's changing with the cloud, whatever. That's set and done already. People are now using AI in so many different ways as well, and it's continuing to change what the attack surface really looks like and what you're able to do and what you're able to test. So people still do not know what their environment looks like, and that's to me, it's always been the biggest challenge to overcome is you can't know what those threats are. You can't know what those risks are until you discover what's really inside your environment. And until you start doing it in a systematic way, other than simply having a CMDB somewhere that's going to record everything, until you have a systematic way of going through and discovering what those things are and putting it into a database, then you're not really going to know.
Yeah. And the sort of piggyback question that I'll point in your direction, Paul, is um, how does my ability to accurately represent that picture of risk that Joe just described, how does that inform my threat intelligence program?
Well, it does. It really helps you narrow down your field of vision, right? So when you get your CGI information, it's very raw. It's very raw. It's broad. It's wide. By doing the type of things Joe's talked about and understanding the breadth and scope of what you're dealing with, it can help you try to understand where you need to be looking for or watching for the attacks to come from, and then what types of CGI you can apply. So, for example, if we are a defense contractor and we deploy a lot of equipment at remote sites, I need to know that I have to extend my boundaries to those remote sites, right? I can't necessarily trust what the infrastructure is that other organization may have deployed for me. I need to be doing something actively as well to protect myself. So we have, I worked with a customer who deployed simulators throughout the world, and come to find out that one place they deployed them, they're having a problem with network activity, so they just opened up the firewall, right? They just allowed all the traffic in. So unless you're aware of things like that and know things like that are taking place, it becomes very, very hard to protect yourself. The other thing to think about too, and which we don't talk enough about, is we need to make this part of our change management process. So I've seen great examples where customers have updated policies or migrated firewalls and forgotten entire sets of rules that
Mhm.
then leave themselves exposed. So, in your change management process, as you're updating configurations, as you're making other changes, there's quite often unintended consequences. So unless you understand the full impact of what that change does and what it could do to your organization or what other downstream effects, you should probably go slow to start and really try to understand that so you don't accidentally shoot yourself in the foot.
For sure. And this gives me a great opportunity to go on a rant for a second. Maybe not so much a rant. So what we're talking about here is exposure management, right? Um, vulnerability management is dead. You may have seen me do a webinar earlier this year where I discussed this with a good friend of mine. Um, Now, when I say vulnerability management is dead, I don't mean you don't need to do vulnerability management. That would be dumb. But your vuln scanner does not spit out the total picture of risk. It's not telling you about exposure. It's telling you about CVEs you have in your environment and, whatever, how many of them are. And you've got 10,000 today and you'll probably have 30,000 in 6 months. And what are you doing? You're not buying that down if you're addressing the criticals just because Nessus tells you it's critical, right? How do you know it's critical? Is it? Is it critical to you? What else in your environment makes that vuln more scary? Misconfigurations, abused identities, whatever it is, right? The total picture of risk is the theory and the practice in exposure management. It's more than just vulnerabilities. And I'm making a point out of this because the next thing I want to talk about is the relationship between exposure and threat intelligence. Um, Obviously, there is a relationship, but I think there's things underneath that question that are a little bit less obvious. Um, because as we start to talk about the relationship between exposure and threat intelligence, we are inevitably going to start to begin to speak about change management in the form of the loop, the cycle. Um, and we're going to talk about CTEM as that loop, as that cycle. So before we start to get into that, because I think a lot of the meat of this conversation is going to wind up in there. Paul, what's the relationship between exposure and threat intelligence?
So there is a direct relationship between that, right? I may have an exposure, and I don't know necessarily how severe it is. Like you said, we have scoring systems and things like that, but that may not necessarily give me the full picture. If I know that I have a threat actor that has proclivities to do things a certain way, use certain tools, I may have a number of exposures that are low exposures. And I look at them and go, really, they're not that bad. But if I know that a threat actor is going to compile those and put them together as a chain of attack against me, that's very different, right? So I may have a very high exposure rating on something, but if I'm not going to get it exploited or there's mitigating controls in front of it, or my current threat intelligence says that's not where the threat's coming from, then I'm probably going to deprioritize that for the ones that I believe are the most critically to be exposed and used against me. That's kind of how I see that relationship unfolding. And then, of course, over time, you always want to patch what you can and where you can and when you can. But the priority in which you do those has to be driven by immediate threat, not by um, potential threat.
Yeah, that's a great way to position it. Joe, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've always been a feeling that in the past we've kind of gone like it feels like this today, and I'm not a fan of that. It has to be data driven. It has to be, and it goes back to my asset management spiel from before, that I'll be able to tell you as long as I know where my crown jewels are, as long as I know where my domain controllers are, as long as I know where the stuff that really matters to me is, I can assign a different level of actual risk to those assets based on what's really exploitable to me. I can understand that there are things that can happen inside, but if I can break down the attack path before it gets to that point, that's certainly going to help. But then, yeah, to your point, Paul, I can prioritize some of those things that might be lower, if those things can really be operationalized by an attacker. So to me, it's still going to keeping me back to knowing what's inside my environment and knowing my telemetry. I'm gonna ring my SIM bell again and say if I don't have the right telemetry to be able to tell me when an attacker is actually in and when they're doing the thing that I'm concerned about, that's another problem for me as well. And that's where I'm going to go back to my blue team and make sure that we have the right logging in place, the right events, the right alerts, however you term it, depending on what solution you use. But yeah, we need to know that the cameras are working and that there's tape in the machine, even though that analogy has no bearing in this world anymore.
Awesome. Yes, 100%. So direct correlation between exposure and the concept of exposure management and CTI as it relates to it's a source of data for you to be able to do that thing and enrich that thing, narrow your lens, be more target focused, etc. Right? Identify your targets. Cool. Now let's talk about CTEM. I know that's like a really bad segue into a giant topic that we could talk about, or at least I could talk about for days. CTEM is something I've become very, very interested in since Gartner turned it into a thing. And I would even argue that I was interested in it before Gartner turned it into a thing because, not to take a stab at Gartner, but I'm going to anyway. Like Gartner is amazing at predicting things that have already happened. And what they did with CTEM is they said like, well, hey, look, these are things that we as practitioners should be doing, right? Well, cool. Let's take a look at it through the lens of reference architecture and decide how we're doing it wrong, and then figure out what we need to do it right. And that's what CTEM is to me, right? It is a rethinking of all the responsibilities that we've always had as practitioners and as CISOs and as heads of and so on. It's just a different way to think about it. And it's a good different way to think about it. For those who are listening who aren't familiar with CTEM as a concept, CTEM is an acronym for Continuous Threat Exposure Management. So we talked about exposures and we talked about exposure management. We talked about threat through the lens of CTI. The thing we haven't talked about yet is continuous, and continuous is what makes CTEM the concept that is causing it to gain so much traction in the industry. You will hear CTEM so many times this year at every conference you go to until you will want to puke. It is going to be all about CTEM all the time, I promise you. Anyway, that being said, so cool. I'm a CTEM shop, right? We just talked about what role CTI play or what role exposure management plays or sort of what the relationship between exposure management and CTI is. But now we get to talk about what role CTI plays in the CTEM cycle. The CTEM cycle consists of 5 stages. Each one of those stages has a very specific set of activities associated with it that give you this ability to sort of have this loop that where the continuous comes from. The very first step in that loop is called scoping. Scoping is where you figure out what you're worried about. You figure out what your most critical assets are. You figure out what grinds this business to a halt if it goes away tomorrow. Okay, cool. Well, the question then is, how does CTI help you better do that? Joe.
The CTI can help you understand as long as you have a good understanding of where your critical assets are. I can take a look at my CTI and tell me, well, what assets do these guys normally come after? What methods do they usually use to come inside my environment? I'm using just an ephemeral version of CTI right now. So what should I be looking for essentially on my boundary? What types of ports and protocols are these guys normally known to use? What data do they normally go after? What are they trying to exfiltrate? So the threat actors that come after my industry, why are they coming after me? Are they coming after me for data exfiltration? Are they coming after me for stopping my business? Are they trying to destroy things? Are they trying to break my manufacturing organization? Are they trying to simply do some defacement on my machines and cause me reputational damage? So understanding who is coming after me is important because then I can bring that back over into the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, procedures that that attacker would use, so that I can better secure my house against the threats that are coming after me. What camera should I be putting out? Where should I be putting them? And what types of locks should I be putting on my doors? And then what motion sensors should I have inside my house in order to give me the best possible telemetry to not only prevent that person from coming in my house, but at some point they're going to come into my house. It's a matter of life. It's just a fact of life. But then how can I possibly track them and then stop them once they get inside? So understanding probably then that trade craft is probably what I would glean from the CTI best.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And as we move along the CTEM cycle and we move into the second stage of the CTEM cycle, which is discovery, our use of CTI and our ability to scope what it is that we care about is now giving us a place to start. Like we talked about before, where do you start and where do you go next? Cool. Now you got a place to start where you can go do your discovery. You go to your next stage, which is prioritization. Cool. Like you see, you're starting to see how this carries forward, right? Like same scope in mind. You've discovered all the things you need to discover from an asset standpoint, a configuration standpoint. And when you get into prioritization, you start to worry about, well, cool, what's the thing that's going to kill me the quickest? And how do I go deal with that? Now, where CTI then comes back to play another considerable role is the final two stages of CTEM, which are validation and mobilization. We'll come back to the mobilization thing in a minute, but you heard Paul talk about change management earlier. Mobilization is essentially how do you effect change in the environment? How do you do it properly? And how does mobilization and the mobilization efforts feed back into the CTEM loop? So you start it all over again, and we do this forever and ever and ever every day, right? But before we get there, let's talk about validation. And Liz, this is probably a good opportunity to drop that poll question about exposure and validation and such. Paul, why is CTI so important when validating security controls?
Well, you want to validate against real threats. You don't want to validate against inferred threats or threats you might think you're having. I've had a number of customers reach out to me. The latest story about Salt Typhoon or some other typhoon breaks, and the first thing they get from their board is, "Are we protected? Are we being targeted?" And they'll reach out to me and go, "You're not even a gnat to them. Like they do not care about you." But this other thing over here, this commodity piece of malware that we're seeing, like Bumblebee, you need to be worrying about that, right? So again, it's all about know your enemy, know yourself. And we have limited amounts of time and money and resources, right? They're not infinite. And if we're going to do it continuously, meaning we want to keep repeating it, we don't want to keep repeating, doing the same mistakes over and over again and expecting a different outcome. We want to have a repeatable cycle that actually delivers value every time. And that means that as your threat posture changes, as your threat actor changes, the type of validations you're doing and frequency of validations and all of that has to change as well. So it has to be adaptive, right? It's not a set it and forget it. You need to be actively involved in protecting yourself.
Yeah, like 100%. And then, like as you're coming out of your validation stage and you're moving into your mobilization stage, which is where you're making decisions about what to actually do, you should get to this stage and feel a lot better that you know what happens next. You know where to go next, right? And then we just do it all over again. We rescope based on what we learn. We re-implement our threat intelligence program to inform that. We rediscover, we reprioritize, we revalidate, we remobilize. We do that forever and ever and ever, and life is perfect. We're doing everything we need to be doing it when we're supposed to be doing it, in theory. And of course, we as an organization will be talking a lot more about CTEM as a concept, and we'll be producing a lot more content about CTEM, and a whole bunch of stuff, which I'll mention more about in a little bit. So cool. All right. We talked about CTI as it relates to CTEM. And we talked about the continuous nature of CTEM. And I don't know if it was explicit in what we were talking about, but the concept of continuous threat intelligence, maybe not a thing that's ever been written on paper, I'm not sure. But what does it mean to make CTI continuous? Up for grabs. Whoever wants to grab that one.
So to me, a lot of times we focus on a point in time, right? Doctor, it hurts when I do this. Well, stop doing that, right?
Yeah.
It's really more about longer term health, right? It's looking
Yeah.
holistically at what's taking place and how things change over time, right? Your infrastructure ages, your deployments age, and the new ones come along, right? So again, understand the maturity of where you're at and being able to address them at their right stage, I think is really important.
Yeah, I mean, that is it, right? That is continuous in its the DNA of continuousness. um all right, cool. So I've got one more question that, like, I think I have the answer to, but I'm gonna bring it up anyway because we want to show everybody something that is pretty cool. As far as I'm concerned, one of the coolest things I think this industry has ever seen, but I'll let y'all be the judge of that. Um, and it's also interesting that we want to show you this stuff because the poll question that we just went through, the majority of people say too much data, not enough context. We
Yep.
get that. We totally get that. That is a problem that we're trying to solve. And so anyway, my question is, why hasn't the industry done more to automate the ingestion of or to consolidate CTI feeds? Like, what are we missing? I have my own response to this question, which might be a little bit contrarian or controversial because I love to bash vendors. It's what it's like I spent 30 years doing. It's because everybody wants to sell you their flavor of the thing, right? Like their flavor is the right flavor, right?
Yes.
We discussed all the way at the top of this conversation that is not true, right? It is not a one size fits all thing. So briefly between you guys, what is the industry getting wrong when it comes to that consolidation, automation of ingestion of CTI feeds?
I think you hit it right. One of the greatest things the industry ever did for itself was adopt MITRE ATT&CK, right? Because before that, we all called things different things and different tactics, different things. There is no standardization in our nomenclature. And you hit it on the head, right? Everybody wants to sell their own CTIs. Mine's better than yours, yours better than mine. We can't even come to an agreeable naming standard, right? Microsoft's gone one way, CrowdStrike's gone another, Palo Alto's gone another. We've tried to pull them together a couple of times, but they eventually just diverge into a mess and a malaise of information. So one of the best things we can do is actually take the lead from our adversaries, right? They're starting to team up together. They're starting to share more things. I think that in our world, being able to have an easy way for the CTI vendors to standardize how they're providing this information, get a standard set of schemas. I know we have sticks and taxi and things like that, but
Yeah.
something a little bit more richer than that. And then, agree to how do we describe an attack, right? How do we describe a 0 day? How do we describe other things? And try to make it a little bit easier for that. Um, our practitioners are drowning. We need to throw them a lifeline as opposed to more, I'm different and better because I say it this way.
Yeah, that's exactly been my experience as well. And I'll call back to my sim days again. Um, Everybody, as soon as ransomware became a thing, everybody had a different way of doing ransomware, protecting against ransomware. That was every EDR, every firewall, every kind of control had their own ransomware thing that they wanted to make into a product and then sell to you. So it speaks directly to that it all comes down to the data once again, that everybody had their own data in their own way, and their way was the best. So it absolutely bifurcated every effort that we had to pull together and say, as a community, that this is what the threat really looks like, and this is how you protect yourself against it.
Yeah.
100%. In the threat intel world, especially, it's gotten to the point even where different vendors are using different nomenclature for the same threat actor or the same threat group or the same malware or the same whatever. So now you got to pick and choose or speak multiple languages or try and integrate. Like, good luck, etc. Okay, cool. AttackIQ has solved this problem. We introduced a product at Black Hat called Watchtower. And it's come a long way even since then, and is one of the coolest things I think exists in the industry, and it's not just because I work here. As a matter of fact, me coming to work for AttackIQ had a lot to do with me seeing Watchtower, and sort of what it enables us to do going forward in the future. So we want to show it to you. So we're going to just run through a quick demo of Watchtower so you can see what it is, how we're thinking about tackling these problems, how we're thinking about solving these problems. Remember my t-shirt slogan about where do I start and where do I go next? That's what this product is intended to do. So take it away.
All right. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the screen here, and let me go share. 1, 2, 3. Yep, this is number 4 now. I don't have enough monitors yet. It's only 4. Okay, so as soon as you get Watchtower enabled, now I'm gonna get up at my standing desk here. You enable Watchtower in your existing AttackIQ enterprise environment, and this is really just your home screen as soon as you log in. As soon as you get Watchtower enabled, you just go right over here to this little tab on your dashboard here. And then you have, and I think Zoom is maybe in my way a little bit. Let's fix that. Okay. And all you need to do to start to get Watchtower working is provide us some CIDR information. So some of your externally facing CIDR blocks. We would start with 5/24 blocks. These are your externally facing ranges that you have. Think of things like your crown jewels, your environment, or maybe something that's been breached before, something you're really concerned about. And these are the things that we want to watch. And what do I mean by watch? Well, we're taking a look at the publicly facing NetFlow data that's coming across the environment. And we have some really good paid feeds that we have for that. And then what we're doing is let's now start to operationalize some of that cyber threat intelligence that we're already bringing in, dozens of different threat feeds that we have agentic AI already built to start to synthesize these flows into actual threats to you. Let's see how that looks under the guise of this Sankey graph that I have right here, this adversarial exposure validation map. So we're pulling all of this together for you and showing you from left to right. Look, here are the threats. Here are the external IP addresses that are being presented to you. Here's how they are presenting in the environment. And if I were to look in this view all, I'd be able to see more of these as well. These are the externally facing IP addresses that are exhibiting the other end of that behavior. So these are really yours. And then at the end of it, what should you be running in the face of that? So now let's start to operationalize it and say, well, not only are these things coming at you, so we're using that analogy and that visual that Paul had before of we want the stuff that's coming at us right now. And I think he's used this analogy a number of times. It's the stuff in the windshield as I'm driving down the highway. I want to see the stuff that's coming at me. I don't only want to be focused on the stuff that's all the way behind me back there. So I can look at the content that I can now say and understand, okay, this is what it is. This is where it came from. This is what it looks like. This is the part of my environment where it's really a problem. Let me go ahead and click on where it says run this scenario. And now I can immediately start to operationalize these things. I can view more of these and I'd be able to expand these out and see what these things are. So if I were to look past the initial Andromeda ones, so you see I have some Bumblebee in here. I have some Mirai in here. So there's definitely stuff in here that I definitely want to take a closer look at. Other things that I can do here, I can take a look at like my key findings, for instance, and it'll give you an explanation in plain English. This is what's happening here. And when I click on that, it will show the work. So it's now going to start to show you, hey, these are all the flows that led to us making this observation about what we saw here. So the time, the source and destination, ports and protocols, and a description in plain English of exactly what these things are and why are they important to you. I can do a similar thing with the Watchtower takeaways. So these are now going to start to be some prioritized things about actions that you should be taking, patching, segmentation, other things that you can do with relation to how these things are occurring inside your environment. And again, I can click on it and it'll show the work. So I can always see the flows that are coming here and what they really mean to me as an organization. I expand these things. Again, it tells me exactly what's happening here. So there it is. So there's my malware, any specific attack details, and what the confidence level of these things are. The Watchtower overview will also give me a nice little compact view of this is my active malware right now. So when I click on one of these bits of malware, it will tell me, again, look, here's my sources and destinations. So these are the places where it's occurring. Here's the content that we would recommend for you. So getting to that validation part of the CTEM framework, we are now pointing you right at, giving you a fantastic divining rod into, hey, here's the content that you should be running, and these are the spots where you should be running it. Take a look inside your environment after we give you these IP addresses so you can see exactly where it is, but it is pointing you right in the spot where we're seeing these kinds of beacons, C2 activity, malicious downloads, all these different types of things that we're seeing here. The IP address intelligence will give me a little bit of and I can click on this and this will start to show me things like, hey, where might I be exposed in my network? Because it's also going to show me, again, ports and protocols, but it's not necessarily tying it to any specific threat, but it is showing me a lot of really good information about where I can shore up my network. I click on one of these, for instance, and yes, it may look like a pew pew map if I'm just looking at it because it's pretty colors on a map. I get it. But we're actually telling you something here. We're not simply throwing lines on a screen and saying, look, bad stuff. It's this is the source, this is the destination port protocol, and an explanation in plain English of what this is. So we're showing you what the problems are and then what you should be doing about it. So this is part of that operationalization, if that's a word, of what we were just talking about. Is one of the biggest problems that we have is we can't operationalize this threat intelligence. Guess what? We just did it through just normal things that you could do, testing that you can do, and let's stretch out a little bit further. Let's expand a little bit more. Let's take a look at these generative inferred threats that are here as well. And what these are doing is this is taking advantage of the technique inference engine. Is that what it is? The TI, which is another project that we worked on with the MITRE Ingenuity Center for Threat Informed Defense. And what this will now do is let's take a look at not only now the things that are in my windshield, the things that are coming right at me. What other things are around me that could be adjacent to that kind of activity? So we didn't necessarily see this specific threat inside my environment, but we are going to make recommendations about content that you should be running inside your environment that would be around, adjacent to, similar to the type of activity that we have already seen. So you can stretch out in the course of any given week and then be able to say, what are the testing that we could be doing? Because this is running on a continuous basis. When we run these polls, we're doing these polls once a week. So you're always going to be looking at what are really the latest threats inside your environment. And we are continuously then, as we do that week poll, then we're doing all this processing of the data. So again, you don't have to, but we will show you the evidence when you need it. And then you're always looking at the latest threats once a week. And that's really a lot of what I wanted to go through. It's super simple, super easy to set up. And the value that you get from it is now I know where I need to go do my testing. And even if you weren't looking at this specific view, there is another view that I could grab that I could just create another assessment from the AttackIQ library here. And it's now just going to say, okay, well, what did Watchtower recommend to me this week? And I could continue through there and I could just simply collect the ones that I want, create the assessment, and off I go. It's that easy for me to just grab the content that Watchtower has already said. Again, it took the context of my environment. It took the context of the threats that are coming after me. It tied that with all those other threat intelligence feeds that are out there that we're using. And by the way, we're also going to start to bring in your threat intelligence, so that we'll be able to use that in our models as well and point you right to the testing that you should be doing. So we'd really short circuit that cycle of trying to understand all the threat intelligence, what's really coming after us, what testing do we need to do this week. We did it all for you. And we put it into an easily consumable package that you can then just go and start doing your testing every week. Pete, Paul, was there anything else that you wanted to add to that, or did I capture it all?
No, I think that's a really good overview. I think the important thing to know about Watchtower is it's telling you what's happening right now, right? What's happening on my edge, what's happening to me, not to someone else. What are the threats I need to worry about right this moment, and not, what I think is happening. So again, going back to that conversation around Salt Typhoon versus Bumblebee, right? This is what I need to worry about right now, and this is what I need to be focused on. That Watchtower overview, that's your 90-second spiel when your CISO picks up the phone and goes, "What's going on?" Right? What's taking place? And you can tell them, "Hey, here's what we're seeing. Here's what we observed. Here's the active malware. Here's our IPs being targeted." Because a lot of times people don't know what IPs are being targeted, right? That everyone always says, "Oh, there's so much scanning, so much noise," and you're absolutely right. When Watchtower runs, it throws away anywhere from 85 to 90% of the flows that we bring in because they are noise. We look for scanning with intent. We want to show you things where a threat actor has a goal or has intent to breach you or compromise you in some way, right? That's where you need to be focused. The other thing we're starting to learn too about Watchtower is we're seeing things that your edge devices can sometimes miss. The reason for that is we are not trying to log every single activity coming into and out of your CIDRs, right? The information we get is sampled, meaning that we'll get every 1 in 1,000 flows or 1 in every 10,000 flows, whatever it is. But because of the volume of traffic coming in, those samples can be statistically meaningful. So oftentimes we will see a threat actor send several single SYN requests to your edges. And most of the time, your infrastructure will throw that away because there's no three-way handshake, right? Nothing was ever completed, so it's of no threat. In actuality, when we analyze those, we can actually show intent, right? So a great example was a customer had a number of scans coming through Tor, going through a private VPN, and then they were scanning adjacent IPs in the CIDR range, looking specifically for remote access protocols, remote access ports. So again, that's something we call scanning with intent, and it's interesting because they took the extra step to anonymize it through Tor and then through a VPN. So those are the type of things we're going to surface for you that you may not see. The other thing that's happening too is if you think about beaconing and what beaconing looks like today, it's very different than it was 5 years ago. A lot of times now, a beacon coming out is a single SYN request, right? A compromised host no longer sends, a blast of UDP across a number of things, or wants to do a three-way handshake and get some CNC back, right? It's a true heartbeat. It's a single SYN packet that goes out to, an endpoint and goes, "Hey, I want to start a conversation," and it goes, "Thanks, that's all I needed to know," and it never responds. Then your infrastructure is like, "Oh, I guess that was a bad connection. I'll just throw that away." So there are times when we find compromises using Watchtower that companies are like, "I don't see that. I don't see that in my logs. I don't see that in my SIM." And it's because we are looking for intent of activity as opposed to just the start and beginning of a transaction, or start and beginning of a piece of net flow.
Yeah. So, I mean, I just want to go back to something I was ranting about earlier. Or maybe it wasn't a rant, but not in my career, number one problem with operationalizing threat intelligence, and you saw it in the poll results, was the amount of data and your ability to contextualize it. The thing that blew my mind when I first saw Watchtower, and so let me be very clear, when I first saw Watchtower in version 0.1, I thought it was trash. And
It was.
it was. But I understood why, where it was going. And then when I saw this version of it, with the agentics in it, and with the context engine in it, and with the CTI feeds in it, and there's a bazillion CTI feeds already into this thing once you take it out of the box. That answered a question for me, or it solved a problem for me, I should say. The answer it gave me was, this is how you operationalize CTI. It's done for me already. I don't need to go buy a recorded feature now. I don't need to have a big fancy SIM now. I mean, maybe you do for other reasons, but for the purpose of hyper localized threat intelligence and a next step to do something with it, that's what blew my mind about Watchtower. So anyway, I'll stop polishing it because.
Well, thank you, Pete. I really appreciate that. We put a lot of effort and time into that. I know we're getting close to the end, and there's a couple of questions specifically around Watchtower I wanted to take a hit. One of the big
Yeah.
ones, what's the source of our net flow? What we've done is we've partnered with a company that actually has access to the BGP flows. For those of you who understand how internet routing works, a lot of information is public, right? How we move information from point A to point B on the internet is entirely public because it has to be, or else you can never route anything. So what we're doing is we're getting the associated public metadata in those BGP flows and pulling those in to look at intent and what's taking place. So when you saw in Watchtower with Joe defining your CIDRs, that restricts what we want to look at for you and make sure we're only looking at the flows for you that matters. Watchtower is agentic based. There's actually three agents that run inside of Watchtower. Just for the sake of time, I'll list them off quickly. The first one is the network agent, which basically separates the wheat from the chaff, right? When I talk about throwing away 85 to 90% of the flows, that's what that agent does. It looks at it and goes, no, this is commodity scanning, this is Shodan, this is census, this is whatever, throws it away. This is normal business activity, throw that away. Now, here's the 10, 15% that we care about. It passes it off to the analysis engine. The analysis engine then looks at it, and it's actually been taught and trained on how to do threat hunting for network flows. And that's all it knows. That's all it's good at. It doesn't do anything else. And it looks at those, and that's what generates that really great textual stuff that you saw earlier, right? The descriptions that come from that. Then the last thing we use is we use Ava. We use our own internal AI to make content recommendations and do inferred threats of what's taking place. So that's kind of how that works. There's another question that asked about the role of CTEM and AI. I have very strong feelings about this. I don't understand how any company will ever successfully secure their agentic workloads and their agentic deployments without CTEM. You think about the very nature of agentic activity, the changing of models, the protocols, the MCP tools, the underlying supply chains. It's a constant group of shifting sands underneath your system. So I can tell you my research that I've been doing for the past several months and the things that we've been working on in the art team to test it, that one day I can run a series of prompt injection attacks against one particular model and they rev it and I run it the next day and I get an entirely different set of results. So I think that CTEM is going to be the thing that's going to be needed to keep our AI safe. If we think back about the rush to the cloud, what happened there, we all rushed to the cloud and bring our mitigating compensating controls with us, and we all got hacked and breached. We can't let that happen again with AI, and I think CTEM is the place you start to protect those workloads.
Could not have said that better myself. 100%. There's I know Benjamin's been asking questions of sort of like OT versus IT and the data in Watchtower, how it translates into an OT world and how that data is able to be contextualized. It's a good question. Paul, anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do see OT flows. We do see that activity. I can tell you in a previous life, threat hunting with these BGP flows, we actually identified Iran targeting Schneider electric controllers and pushing down fully compromised firmware to them. So we will see unusual flows like that, and Watchtower will identify them as different types of OT protocols and OT protocol scanning. So yeah, we will see that.
Um, I know we have like a minute, if that. I just want to make sure we covered everybody's questions. We went over the AI to determine threats thing. We talked a little bit about OT. We talked about how we do the NetFlow stuff. Um, well, I also want to make sure I get to plug a couple of things before we get out of here. AttackIQ Academy is a free resource with a massive library of educational content. Go there and check out, for example, our Foundations of Threat Intelligence. Learn more deeply about threat intel and its sort of operationalization. And coming soon, you're going to be able to get access to our Foundations of CTEM. That should be coming out in the next couple of weeks, taught by yours truly. I feel like it came off as boring, but hey, like it's CTEM. What do you want? But go check that out, and tons of other Academy content. And like I said earlier, there's so much more CTEM content coming from us. not just from a collateral standpoint or from an educational standpoint, but from a functionality standpoint. The future is going to start looking very interesting as it relates to, our AI roadmap and how we're using AI, not only to defend, but as something to defend against. And so obviously we'll do more talking about that stuff in the future. I want to say thanks everybody for taking time out of your day, not only on my side of the fence, but everybody that joined in. We really, really appreciate it. I have a ton of fun doing these things. I hope everybody else does. And I appreciate it. And we'll see you on the next one. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thanks for having us, Pete.